Hi, before I get into the main theme of this video, regarding my last video, after uploading it, I did actually discover that the audio tape that I mentioned was actually played to the court. That is of Amber Heard basically admitting that she abused, or rather not denying, that she violently attacked Johnny Depp, but she was arguing over the precise nature of it. Anyway, I included that link. So the jury's heard it now. I don't know how they can rule in her favor. I just don't see how they could do that. Anyway, on the main gist of this video, I want to talk about punditry versus reporting the news in the domain of journalism. I think this is an extremely important issue. Extremely important, especially in terms of broadcast news. It applies to some extent with print news as well, because in newspapers you also have like staff journalists who will be the correspondent for a particular subject, and then you have more high profile journalists, and they're not always journalists, it could be politicians or other public figures who have an op-ed, which is basically an opinion piece. To get to that level, you have to either be a journalist who has proven his or herself, or a public figure, so people will recognize the name. I think it's a luxury. I think it's a very good position to be in, and I do aspire to get there. I'd love to have my views, published in a national newspaper in that way. I think an op-ed can be a powerful thing. I've read quite a few over the years, and there's some journalists who stand out. Mima Lewis, I like some of her stuff. David Cameron's former speechwriter Claire Folges has had some good stuff. There's others I'm probably negating to mention. Um, William Hague, former Tory leader, has had a few good articles, a few good op-eds. My friend Melissa Chen, who's based in the United States. I say friend, speaking honestly, we're more acquaintances, but she's a very good journalist. Okay, so punditry versus reporting news. I think there's a lot of blurring of lines with this, and that's just one reason why earlier I made that critical video about Kim Iverson on the Hill, because I think she conflates reporting news with her own punditry and her own partisanship. Um, Here's the thing with journalism. I think it is a misconception that journalists have to be 50-50, they have to be neutral. I think that's never been the issue. I don't think it's about journalists being neutral, and I think even if that was what it should be about, I don't think it's possible. I think with the best will in the world, there's always going to be some degree of bias. But I don't think it's actually about journalists having to be neutral. I agree with Christiane Amanpour when she said this on CNN, the little soundbite. It's not about being neutral, it's about telling the truth. That's not verbatim, but it was along those lines. Um, Now, some will say, well, CNN doesn't always tell the truth. I think the CNN, just to focus briefly on that, I think for the most part, I think their international coverage is quite good. But they do have a lot of punditry, and I think in American politics, particularly around racial issues, are extremely biased. The way they cover, for example, Black Lives Matter or anything involving um, black people and the police is very different from white people. And I do think it's pretty disgraceful the way powerful networks like CNN cover racial issues. Their lack of consistency, their willful inflaming of tensions, I think, is reprehensible. But CNN's a big network, and they also do some good things. The Freedom Project is a good thing, and I think they've got some good journalists. I do think it's troubling that the cynicism that people have of the mainstream media, which is not a term I like to use, that's not my terminology, but to designate it, big networks, CNN, the BBC tend to be the two they think of. Um, the interesting thing, the reason I don't like mainstream media as a concept is because it's poorly defined. The sort of people who talk about mainstream media, um, they don't usually define what that is. I've seen people who, watch Fox News talk about mainstream media. Well, I would argue Fox News is the mainstream of the American right. So in that sense, it's mainstream. Russia Today (RT) was mainstream in the sense that it was Russian state propaganda. It is Russian state propaganda. So as an adjective, mainstream, you know, um, anything that has a large viewing base can be described as mainstream. That's why I don't like the term. However, let's just say for simplicity's sake, the fact there is such disillusionment in mainstream media that people are going to alternative sources, they are willing to believe dubious sources, it is concerning. And I think rather than getting defensive, big networks need to have some introspection. They need to frankly show some humility. I believe this strongly. I do think there is a very, very arrogant streak in the BBC and especially in CNN where there's just a failure in introspect. You have the pundits standing up and getting defensive and, um, defensive from the criticism, but they will never introspect and say, can we improve? And I think that comes across as extremely arrogant. Now, maybe they genuinely believe they're doing things right, but no one can be perfect. You can always improve. Um, so, on this issue of reporting news versus punditry, how do we differentiate it? It's extremely important. So, reporting news, let's give an example. Today, an airstrike in the Ukrainian town of fill the blank killed 20 civilians. Um, Reports indicate women and children were among the dead, and many of the victims were refugees fleeing. Right, that would be a typical report, just stating the known facts. And then we can add Russia has denied responsibility. That would be a typical report, so it's just stating the known facts. The punditry would be um, this is the latest Russian atrocity in Ukraine, or um, Russia has alleged that NATO has planted this to vilify the Russian state. And then let's look at NATO's track record. This is the sort of thing Kim Iverson would do. Um, so that's the difference between reporting the news and punditry. The most important principle for any journalist, whatever medium they're in, whether they're in the print press, whether they are in media journalism, whether they are a staff reporter, whether they're a freelancer, any journalist should be the truth. That should be the number one thing. It's not about being neutral. In the case of Ukraine and Russia, it's a David and Goliath situation. So the idea of being neutral is patently absurd. I mean, that would require a journalist to look at the hundreds of civilians killed and say, well, I better be neutral because I don't want to offend Russian viewers. So we better say, oh, but there's been atrocities on both sides. Now, if there's no evidence to that end, journalists can't say that just to appear neutral. That's why the concept of neutrality in journalism is too simplistic. What journalists should do is tell the truth and be fair in doing that. Also, if you're reporting, it's extremely important not to become the story. I think, particularly in the States, punditry is very, very strong. I actually think it's less obvious on the BBC. Now, don't get me wrong, to British viewers, I'm not for a second saying that there isn't bias at the BBC. I'm not saying that there isn't punditry at the BBC. But I would say the actual airtime which is involved in just plain reporting and call it bias reporting, but just plain reporting versus people sort of pontificating and lecturing the audience is far more obvious in the States. I would say a good portion of CNN's airtime is punditry. It's very obvious. Same with Fox News. Now that's the left and the right. Um, I think where the BBC bias comes from is more some of its policies, particularly its absolute intense devotion to the religion of diversity, to the point of being silly. The BBC's long been accused of political correctness, but it's actually, I think it goes beyond that. Um, but in terms of actual punditry, I honestly don't think that you get that same situation on the BBC of people sort of sitting around the studio and, criticizing the government or criticizing foreign policy, whatever it might be. You do get some of it. I just don't think it's to the same extent as you would get in the American newsrooms. I mean, in the States, you have entire shows dedicated to that. In Britain, I would say it's more obvious on Sky News. That style of, I think is more obvious on Sky. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that punditry, there's no place for it. I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing. A good journalist, someone who can articulate their argument well, it's a position of power and influence, but that can be, if they're telling the truth, um, not distorting facts, not leaving key information out. Um, if they are articulating the view without doing it to the point of being manipulative, then I think there's a place for that, and I think that could be a powerful thing in a good way. Also, journalists are human; they're going to have it's very difficult if, for example, you have a reporter who's been to the scene of a mass shooting at a school. Now, that reporter might be a father or a mother. The professional side of them would have to just report the facts as they are known. So they can't say, this is horrible and the NRA needs to do one. Okay, they can't say that in a report. But they cannot be blamed for perhaps getting emotional because it's a human instinct. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges for a journalist. It's something that I'm anticipating, when I get further into this. If I'm ever in a distressing situation, will I be able to basically keep my emotions in check? Will I be able to keep my cool? I often think, journalists who are covering war crimes and so on, human side of them must feel disgusted and outraged. Or to give another example, Ross Kemp, the actor and journalist, uh, one of the bravest men I can think of. He's been in some real dangerous places, slums and prisons and so on. He's interviewed from some truly despicable human beings who have no remorse for their crimes, who've done some truly evil things. And you could tell that he was really working hard to keep his emotions in check. And he done it, he's a professional, he done it. But I think that does take some willpower. I mean, I think right now, apparently there's been some exhibition in a museum in Moscow detailing NATO's long record of crimes and distorting what's happening in Ukraine. Now, if I were a journalist covering that, I admit it would be a challenge because I would want to say, well, wait a second, where's the pictures of Russian war crimes? I'd probably ask the question, but keeping my emotions in check because I am an opinionated and political person. So I am fully aware that as a journalist, I need to be very, very self-critical that I don't, you know, blur the lines. If I'm doing an op-ed or if I'm making it clear that I am reporting from a certain angle, okay. If I'm tasked to just do a report, I have to just stick with the facts. And I think people don't realize how challenging journalism is as a profession because so much of it is about getting a very difficult balance. Um, Sometimes you even get journalists, particularly when we have this kind of cultural divide. You often get, for example, the BBC is attacked by Chinese nationalists when all they're doing is literally just reporting the story. They're not even criticizing the Chinese government. And you'll get people saying, oh, this is just Western media trying to make China look bad. I've seen this a lot on BBC India, where Modi supporters say, well, the BBC is anti India. They're always trying to make us look bad, even when the report is simply asking a question or stating the facts. It's not saying this is right or wrong. Um, that's something that is a challenge. Another thing people don't realize is the barriers that journalists face. So, you can't say this isn't being covered, but simultaneously defend a government or a regime or a group that is preventing journalists from doing their job in that sense. So, access to journalists is a major issue. But I do think that all journalists just need to be aware that there is a difference between punditry and reporting. Punditry has a place, fine, have your opinions, argue the case, and pontificate, and do it in an intelligent way. But don't say that is just reporting the news because it's not. That doesn't mean it's falsehood. That doesn't mean that it's not true, but it is ultimately an opinion. Maybe an opinion based on the facts, but it is an opinion. Um, that's very different from just stating the news. you know. So we'll leave it there, but I think it's an extremely important issue. I do think there's a place for punditry, for debate. I think there should be less of it, particularly on broadcast news. I think probably there's more of a place for it in print news. Um, in broadcast news, I think it takes up too much time. I think there should be maybe a segment, one sort of debate style program. I think the main news should be based on just reporting. That's the case with the BBC. I would say less so with the American outlets. I think they are extremely partisan. They claim they're not. And you'll have on Fox News a token liberal, and you'll have on CNN a token conservative, but both are very biased, and they can't rationally claim that they're not. I think the fact that they deny it just, deepens the mistrust. If they were more upfront about the fact that they are a left liberal news network, then I think people would trust them more. I think they've got some very capable journalists, but the angle that CNN takes, I keep mentioning CNN because it is one of the biggest. Um, anyway, I'll leave it there. But reporting versus punditry, very important to tell the difference. And in conclusion, I'm not someone who thinks that journalists cannot have opinions. I think that's a huge misconception. Journalists can have opinions. Journalists are human. They will have emotions. They will have views on things. They might like or dislike the person they are interviewing. But if they're a professional, they'll be able to draw the distinction between plain reporting or a plain interview versus starting to inject their own views in it. An example of this lack of professionalism was Kathy Newman and Jordan Peterson. That was an example of a journalist bringing her own agenda into the interview. She wanted to just show off her feminist credentials. It was one of the worst interviews I ever saw, really, um, because she just went in, determined to attack Peterson, determined to try and put him on the spot. It was really a gotcha style interview. It was a disaster. Um, and then, of course, when his fans and others criticized her, she played the victim. Although she did admit it wasn't her best interview. But that's an example of what not to do. And actually, up until that point, I thought she was an okay journalist. I never thought that she, was second rate or anything. But at that point, I just thought the lack of professionalism was astounding in that interview. So, reporting versus punditry, that is my take. A final word, final word. All of these videos is punditry. This is me talking and pontificating. So pretty much all the videos I make it is punditry. I admit that because it's my platform, it's my channel. It's This is my punditry. If this channel was purely for reporting news, I would take quite a different angle with it. But it is what it is. Right, thanks for watching.